Alrighty, sorry about the delay. Welcome back to, I guess we're calling this Fraggoth Reads still. I need to come up with a better name. I'm Fraggoth, I read. And this week I'll be reading, getting started on reading, Distress by Greg Egan. It's been a little while since we've had an Egan. This one was first published in, my gut says, the late 90s. Maybe 97, 98? 1997. The edition I'm working with is from 2015 by Nightshade Books. And let's see when it cycles. The cover currently on screen for me right now is the same as the edition that I'm holding. It's sort of a ball with a bunch of star-shaped objects. Wow, we have a bunch of people tuning in today. Hello, Franknizers, as ever. Liz Angel 45, hello. And Rob C. Godin. Hey man, just jumping in to say I'm a big fan. I listen while doing spreadsheets at work. The best time to listen to anything, I should think, as someone who has done the database management and similar grind. I feel you there. Alrighty, let's get through to the start of Chapter 5, and we'll see where we're at. It has been a very long time since I have read Distress. Probably since not long after it was republished in 2015. It's been at least 5 years. So this might start off rough because I won't actually remember where we're going. If I'm correct, this, like a bunch of his early work, pre-Clockwork Rocket, slash Arrow of Time trilogy, this basically was one of his books that involves some kind of mathpocalypse, where arithmetic run rogue is going to be perilous, but I honestly don't remember for sure, because I get it, because I went on a binge, getting and reading new and other Greg Egan stuff, and so some of them blur together, because, that was solid months of my life spent in Egan-esque worlds. So I guess until I remember what's going on and until I have anything to say about what's going on, I guess we'll just get going on. Alrighty. Let me get a quick sip of water in and we will get rolling. Distress by Greg Egan. It is not true that the map of freedom will be complete with the erasure of the last invidious border, when it remains for us to chart the attractors of thunder and delineate the arrhythmias of drought, to reveal the molecular dialects of forest and savanna, as rich as 1,000 human tongues, and to comprehend the deepest histories of our passions, ancient beyond mythology's reach. So I declare that no corporation holds a monopoly on numbers, no patent can encompass 0 and 1, no nation has sovereignty over adenine and guanine, no empire rules the quantum waves. And there must be room for all at the celebration of understanding, for there is a truth which cannot be bought or sold, imposed by force, resisted, or escaped. From Technolibération by Muteba Kazadi, 2019. Part 1. Chapter 1.
All right, he's dead. Go ahead and talk to him.
The bioethicist was a laconic young asex with blonde dreadlocks and a t-shirt which flashed up the slogan, "Say no to tow," in between the paid advertising. The countersigned the permission form on the forensic pathologist's notepad, then withdrew to a corner of the room. The trauma specialist and the paramedic wheeled their resuscitation equipment out of the way, and the forensic pathologist hurried forward, hypodermic syringe in hand, to administer the first dose of neuropreservative. Useless prior to legal death, massively toxic to several organs on a time scale of hours, the cocktail of glutamate antagonists, calcium channel blockers, and antioxidants would halt the most damaging biochemical changes in the victim's brain almost immediately. The pathologist's assistant followed close behind her, with a trolley bearing all the paraphernalia of post-mortem revival, a tray of disposable surgical instruments, several racks of electronic equipment, an arterial pump fed from 3 glass tanks the size of water coolers, and something resembling a hairnet made out of gray superconducting wire. Lukowski, the homicide detective, was standing beside me. He mused, "If everyone was fitted out like you, Worth, we'd never have to do this. We could just replay the crime from start to finish, like reading an aircraft's black box." I replied without looking away from the operating table. I could edit out our voices easily enough, but I wanted a continuous take of the pathologist connecting up the surrogate blood supply. If everyone had optic nerve taps, don't you think murderers would start hacking the memory chips out of their victims' bodies?
Sometimes, but no one hung around to mess up this guy's brain, did they?
Wait until they've seen the documentary. The pathologist's assistant sprayed a depilatory enzyme onto... The pathologist's assistant sprayed a depilatory enzyme onto the victim's skull, and then wiped all the close-cropped black hair away with a couple of sweeps of his gloved hand. As he dropped the mess into a plastic sample bag, I realized why it was holding together instead of dispersing like barbershop's waste. Several layers of skin had come with it. The assistant glued the hairnet, a skein of electrodes and squid detectors, to the bare... and that's SQID, squid. The assistant glued the hairnet, a skein of electrodes and squid detectors, to the bare pink scalp. The pathologist finished checking the blood supply, then made an incision in the trachea and inserted a tube, hooked up to a small pump to take the place of the collapsed lungs. Nothing to do with respiration, purely as an aid to speech. It was possible to monitor the nerve impulses to the larynx and synthesize the intended sounds by wholly electronic means, but apparently the voice was always less garbled if the victim could experience something like the normal tactile and auditory feedback produced by a vibrating column of air. The assistant fitted a padded bandage over the victim's eyes. In rare cases, feeling could return sporadically to the skin of the face, and since retinal cells were deliberately not revived, some kind of temporary ocular injury was the easiest lie to explain away the pragmatic blindness. I thought again about possible narration. In 1888, police surgeons photographed the retinas of one victim of Jack the Ripper, in the vain hope that they might discover the face of the killer, embalmed in the light-sensitive pigments of the human eye. No, too predictable, and too misleading. Revival was not a process of extracting information from a passive corpse. But what were the alternative references? Orpheus? Lazarus? The monkey's paw? The telltale heart? Reanimator? Nothing in myth or fiction had really prefigured the truth. Better to make no glib comparisons. Let the corpse speak for itself. A spasm passed through the victim's body. A temporary pacemaker was forcing his damaged heart to beat, operating at power levels which would poison every cardiac muscle fiber with electrochemical byproducts in 15 or 20 minutes at the most. Pre-oxygenated ersatz blood was being fed into his heart's left atrium in lieu of a supply from the lungs, pumped through the body once only, then removed via the pulmonary arteries and discarded. An open system was less trouble than recirculation in the short term. The half-repaired knife wounds in his abdomen and torso made a mess, leaking thin scarlet fluid into the drainage channels of the operating table, but they posed no real threat. 100 times as much blood was being extracted every second, deliberately. No one had bothered to remove the surgical larvae, though, so they kept on working as if nothing had changed, stitching and chemically cauterizing the smaller blood vessels with their jaws, cleaning and disinfecting the wounds, sniffing about blindly for necrotic tissue and clots to consume. Maintaining the flow of oxygen and nutrients to the brain was essential, but it wouldn't reverse the deterioration which had already taken place. The true catalysts of revival were the billions of liposomes, microscopic drug capsules made from lipid membranes, being infused along with the ersatz blood. One key protein embedded in the membrane unlocked the blood-brain barrier, enabling the liposomes to burrow out of the cerebral capillaries into the interneural space. Other proteins caused the membrane itself to fuse with the cell wall of the first suitable neuron it encountered, disgorging an elaborate package of biochemical machinery to re-energize the cell, mop up some of the molecular detritus of ischemic damage, and protect against the shock of re-oxygenation. I challenge you to read through that paragraph without stumbling just a little bit, okay? That was a lot of syllables. Making me exercise my brain-mouth barrier. Other liposomes were tailored for other cell types. Muscle fibers in the vocal fold, the jaw, the lips, the tongue, receptors in the inner ear. They all contained drugs and enzymes with similar effects, hijacking the dying cell and forcing it, briefly, to marshal its resources for one final, unsustainable burst of activity. Revival was not resuscitation pushed to heroic extremes. Revival was permitted only when the long-term survival of the patient was no longer a consideration, because every method which might have achieved that outcome had already failed. The pathologist glanced at a display screen on the equipment trolley. I followed her gaze. There were wave traces showing erratic brain rhythms, and fluctuating bar graphs measuring toxins and breakdown products being flushed out of the body. Lukowski stepped forward expectantly. I followed him. The assistant hit a button on the keypad. The victim twitched and coughed blood, some of it still his own, dark and clotted. The wave traces spiked, then became smoother, more periodic. Lukowski took the victim's hand and squeezed it, a gesture which struck me as cynical, although for all I knew it might have reflected a genuine compassionate impulse. I glanced at the bioethicist. Viz. T-shirt now read, "Credibility is a commodity." I couldn't decide if that was a sponsored message or a personal opinion. Lukowski said, "Daniel? Danny? Can you hear me?" There was no obvious physical response, but the brain waves danced. Daniel Cavallini was a music student, 19 years old. He'd been found around 11, bleeding and unconscious, in a corner of the town hall railway station, with watch, notepad, and shoes still on him, unlikely in a random mugging gone wrong. I'd been hanging out with the homicide squad for a fortnight, waiting for something like this. Warrants for revival were issued only if the evidence favored the victim being able to name the assailant. There was little prospect of obtaining a usable verbal description of a stranger, let alone an identikit of the killer's face. Lukowski had woken a magistrate just after midnight, the minute the prognosis was clear. Cavallini's skin was turning a strange shade of crimson as more and more revived cells began taking up oxygen. The alien-hued transporter molecule in the ersatz blood was more efficient than hemoglobin, but like all the other revival drugs, it was ultimately toxic. The pathologist's assistant hit some more keys. Cavallini twitched and coughed again. It was a delicate balancing act. Small shocks to the brain were necessary to restore the major coherent rhythms, but too much external interference could wipe out the remnants of short-term memory. Even after legal death, neurons could remain active deep in the brain, keeping the symbolic firing pattern representations of recent memories circulating for several minutes. Revival could temporarily restore the neural infrastructure needed to extract those traces, but if they'd already died away completely, or been swamped by the efforts to recover them, interrogation was pointless. Lukowski said soothingly,
"You're okay now, Danny. You're in a hospital. You're safe. But you have to tell me who did this to you. Tell me who had the knife."
A hoarse whisper emerged from Cavallini's mouth. One faint, aspirated syllable, then silence. My skin crawled with predictable monkey's paw horror, but I felt an idiotic surge of exultation, too, as if part of me simply refused to accept that this sign of life could not be a sign of hope. Cavallini tried again, and the second attempt was more sustained. His artificial exhalation, detached from voluntary control, made it sound like he was gasping for breath. The effect was pitiful, but he wasn't actually short of oxygen at all. His speech was so broken and tortuous that I couldn't make out a single word, but an array of piezoelectric sensors was glued to his throat and wired to a computer. I turned to the display panel.
"Why can't I see?" Lukowski said. "Your eyes are bandaged. There will be a couple of broken blood vessels, but they've been repaired. There'll be no permanent damage, I promise. So just lie still and relax, and tell me what happened." "What time is it? Please, I better call home. I better tell them." "We've spoken to your parents. They're on their way. They'll be here as soon as possible."
That much was true, but even if they showed up in the next 90 seconds, they would not be allowed into the room.
"You were waiting for the train home, weren't you? Platform 4, remember? Waiting for the 10:30 to Strathfield. But you didn't get on. What happened?"
I saw Lukowski's gaze shift to a graph below the transcript window, where half a dozen rising curves recording improved vital signs were extended by dashed computer projections. All of the projected curves hit their peaks a minute or so in the future, then swiftly declined.
"He had a knife."
Cavallini's right arm began to twitch, and his slack facial muscles came to life for the first time, taking on a grimace of pain.
"It still hurts. Please help me."
The bioethicist glanced calmly at some figures on the display screen, but declined to intervene. Any effective anesthetic would damp down neural activity too much to allow the interrogation to continue. It was all or nothing, abort or proceed.
Lukowski said gently, "The nurse is getting some painkillers. Hang in there, man, it won't be long. But tell me, who had the knife?"
The faces of both of them were glistening with sweat now. Lukowski's arm was scarlet up to the elbow. I thought, if you found someone dying on the pavement in a pool of blood, you'd ask the same questions, wouldn't you? And tell the same reassuring lies?
"Who was it, Danny?"
"My brother."
"Your brother had the knife?"
"No, he didn't. I can't remember what happened. Ask me later. My head's too fuzzy now."
"Why did you say it was your brother? Was it him or wasn't it?"
"Of course it wasn't him. Don't tell anyone I said that. I'll be all right if you stop confusing me. Can I have the painkillers now? Please?"
His face flowed and froze like a sequence of masks, making his suffering seem stylized, abstract. He began to move his head back and forth, weakly at first, then with manic speed and energy. I assumed he was having some kind of seizure. The revival drugs were overstimulating some damaged neural pathway. Then he reached up with his right hand and tore away the blindfold. His head stopped jerking immediately. Maybe his skin had grown hypersensitive and the blindfold had become an unbearable irritation. He blinked a few times, then squinted up at the room's bright lights. I could see his pupils contract, his eyes moving purposefully. He raised his head slightly and examined Lukowski, then looked down at his own body and its strange adornments. The pacemaker's brightly colored ribbon cable, the heavy plastic blood supply tubes, the knife wounds full of glistening white maggots. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, while he inspected the needles and electrodes buried in his chest, the strange pink tide washing out of him, his ruined lungs, his artificial airway. The display screen was behind him, but everything else was there to be taken in at a glance. In a matter of seconds, he knew. I could see the weight of understanding descend on him. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His expression shifted rapidly. Through the pain there was a sudden flash of pure astonishment, and then an almost amused comprehension of the full strangeness, and maybe the perverse virtuosity, of the feat to which he'd been subjected. For an instant he really did look like someone admiring a brilliant, vicious, bloody, practical joke at his own expense. Then he said clearly, between enforced robotic gasps,
I don't think this is a good idea. I don't want to talk any more.
He closed his eyes and sank back onto the table. His vital signs were descending rapidly. Lukowski turned to the pathologist. He was ashen, but he still gripped the boy's hand.
How could the retinas function? What did you do? You stupid...
He raised his free hand as if to strike her, but he didn't follow through. The bioethicist's T-shirt read, "Eternal love is a love pet, made from your own loved one's DNA." The pathologist, standing her ground, screamed back at Lukowski, "You had to push him, didn't you? You had to keep on and on about the brother while his stress hormone index climbed straight into the red." I wondered who'd decided what a normal level of adrenaline was, for the state of being dead from knife wounds, but otherwise relaxed. Someone behind me emitted a long string of incoherent obscenities. I turned to see the paramedic, who would have been with Cavallini since the ambulance. I hadn't even realized that he was still in the room. He was staring at the floor, fists clenched tight, shaking with anger. Lukowski grabbed my elbow, staining me with synthetic blood. He spoke in a strange whisper, He spoke in a stage whisper, as if hoping to keep his words off the soundtrack.
You can film the next one, okay? This has never happened before. Never. And if you show people a 1 in a million glitch as if it was...
The bioethicist ventured mildly.
"I think the guidelines for the Taylor Committee on Optional Restraints make it clear."
The pathologist's assistant turned on her, outraged. "Who asked you for an opinion? Procedure is none of your business, you pathetic—" An ear-splitting alarm went off, somewhere deep in the electronic guts of the revival apparatus. The pathologist's assistant bent over the equipment and bashed on the keypad like a frustrated child attacking a broken toy, until the noise went away. In the silence that followed, I almost closed my eyes, invoked "witness," stopped recording. I'd seen enough. Then Daniel Cavallini regained consciousness and began to scream. I watched as they pumped him full of morphine and waited for the revival drugs to finish him off. Oh, thanks for tuning in, Severo. Happy Friday, Frag. Stop me if I've asked you this before, but do you recall any sci-fi novel with a villain who keeps a disembodied head alive on life support to torment? I think that character was a rebel leader, but I can't recall much else. Ring any bells? Oh, gosh. I'm trying to think of stuff. Because that's a relatively common tropism, is keeping the head. Although, not necessarily alive to torment. Off the top of my head, that might have been a feature in one of the Star Wars short stories, or possibly something related to Prince Shizor, like Shadow of the Empire, or the Bounty Hunter trilogy, or Boba Fett trilogy, because he features pretty sizably in that. Scratch that. I don't think he did in Shadows of the Empire, so he probably didn't in the other. That does ring a bell, but nothing more specific than that. I'd kind of need like a publishing date range, and I could narrow it down a bit. I'll keep it in mind. I'll think about it. Chapter 2. It was just after 5 as I walked down the hill from Eastwood Railway Station. The sky was pale and colorless. Venus was fading slowly in the east, but the street itself already looked exactly as it did by daylight, just inexplicably deserted. My carriage on the train had been empty too. Last human on Earth time. Birds were calling, loudly, in the lush bushland which lined the railway corridor, and in the labyrinth of wooded parks woven into the surrounding suburb. Many of the parks resembled pristine forest, but every tree, every shrub was engineered, at the very least drought and fire-resistant, shedding no messy, flammable twigs, bark, or leaves. Dead plant tissue was resorbed, cannibalized. I'd seen it portrayed in time-lapse, one kind of photography I never carried out myself. An entire brown and wilting branch shrinking back into the living trunk. Most of the trees generated a modest amount of electricity, ultimately from sunlight, although the chemistry was elaborate, and the release of stored energy continued 24 hours a day. Specialized routes sought out the underground superconductors snaking through the parks, and fed in their contributions. 2 1/4 volts was about as intrinsically safe as electric power could be, but it required zero resistance for efficient transmission. Some of the fauna had been modified too. The magpies were docile even in spring, the mosquitoes shunned mammalian blood, and the most venomous snakes were incapable of harming a human child. Small advantages over their wild cousins, tied to the biochemistry of the engineered vegetation, guaranteed the altered species' dominance in this microecology, and small handicaps kept them from flourishing if they ever escaped to one of the truly wild reserves, distant from human habitation. I was renting a small detached unit in a cluster of 4, set in a zero-maintenance garden which merged seamlessly with the tendril of parkland at the end of the cul-de-sac. I'd been there for 8 years, ever since my first commission from CNET. But that's SEENET. With a capital S and a capital N. But I still felt like a trespasser. Eastwood was just 18 kilometers from the center of Sydney, which, although ever fewer people had reason to travel there, still seemed to hold an inexplicable sway over real estate prices. I couldn't have bought the unit myself in 100 years. The barely affordable rent was just a felicitous byproduct of the owner's elaborate tax evasion schemes, and it was probably only a matter of time before some quiver of butterfly wings in the world financial markets rendered the network slightly less generous, or my landowner slightly less in need of a write-off, and I'd be picked up and flung 50 kilometers west, back to the outer sprawl where I belonged. I approached warily. Home should have felt like a sanctuary after the night's events, but I hesitated outside the front door, key in hand, for something like a minute. Gina was up, dressed and in the middle of breakfast. I hadn't seen her since the same time the day before. It was as if I'd never left. She said, "How was filming?" I'd sent her a message from the hospital, explaining that we'd finally got lucky. "I don't want to talk about it." I retreated into the living room and sank into a chair. The action of sitting seemed to replay itself in my inner ears. I kept descending again and again. I fixed my gaze on the pattern in the carpet. The illusion slowly faded.
Andrew, what happened? She followed me into the room. Did something go wrong? Will you have to reshoot?
I said I don't want to... I caught myself. I looked up at her and forced myself to concentrate. She was puzzled, but not yet angry. Rule number 3. Tell her everything, however unpleasant, at the first opportunity, whether you feel like it or not. Anything less will be treated as deliberate exclusion and taken as a personal affront. I said, I won't have to reshoot. It's over. I recounted what had happened. Gina looked ill.
And was anything he said worth extracting? Did mentioning his brother make the slightest sense, or was he just brain damaged and ranting?
That's still not clear. Evidently the brother does have a history of violence. He was on probation for assaulting his mother. They've taken him in for questioning, but it could all come to nothing. If the victim's short-term memories were lost, he could have pieced together a false reconstruction of the stabbing, using the first person who came to mind as being capable of the act. And when he changed his story, he might not have been covering up at all. He might simply have realized that he was amnesic.
Gina said, and even if the brother did kill him, no jury is going to accept a couple of words instantly retracted as any kind of proof. If there's a conviction, it will have nothing to do with the revival.
It was difficult to argue the point. I had to struggle to regain some perspective. Not in this case, no. But there have been times when it's made all the difference. The victim's word alone might never stand up in court, but there have been people tried for murder who would never have been suspected otherwise. Cases when the evidence which actually convicted them was only pieced together because the revival testimony put the investigation on the right track.
Gina was dismissive. That may have happened once or twice, but it's still not worth it. They should ban the whole procedure. It's obscene.
She hesitated.
But you're not going to use that footage, are you?
Of course I'm going to use it.
You're going to show a man dying in agony on an operating table, captured in the act of realizing that everything which brought him back to life is guaranteed to kill him?
She spoke calmly. She sounded more incredulous than outraged. I said, "What do you want me to use instead? A dramatization where everything goes according to plan?"
No, but why not a dramatization where everything goes wrong in exactly the way it did last night?
Why? It's already happened, and I've already filmed it. Who benefits from a reconstruction?
The victim's family, for a start.
I thought, possibly. But would a reconstruction really spare their feelings? And no one was going to force them to watch the documentary in either case. I said, "Be reasonable. This is powerful stuff. I can't just throw it away, and I have every right to use it. I had permission to be there, from the cops, from the hospital, and I'll get the family's clearance."
You mean the network's lawyers will browbeat them into signing some kind of waiver in the public interest?
I had no answer to that. It was exactly what would happen. I said, "You're the one who just declared that revival is obscene. You want to see it banned? This can only help your cause. It's as good a dose of Frankenscience as any dumb Luddite could ask for." Gina looked stung. I couldn't tell if she was faking. She said,
I have a doctorate in material science, you peasant, so don't call me.
I didn't. You know what I meant.
If anyone's a Luddite, you are. This entire project is just beginning to sound like Edenite propaganda. Junk DNA. What's the subtitle? The Biotechnology Nightmare?
Close.
What I don't understand is why you couldn't include a single positive story.
I said wearily, "We've been over this before. It's not up to me. The networks won't buy anything unless there's an angle. In this case, the downside of biotech. That's the choice of subject. That's what it's about. It isn't meant to be balanced. Balance confuses the marketing people. You can't hype something which contains two contradictory messages. But at least it might counteract all the hymns of praise to genetic engineering everyone's been gagging on lately. And, taken along with everything else, it does show the whole picture by adding what they've all left out." Gina was unmoved.
That's disingenuous. Our sensationalism balances their sensationalism. It doesn't. It just polarises opinion. What's wrong with a calm, reasoned presentation of the facts, which might help to get revival and a few other blatant atrocities outlawed, without playing up all the old transgressions against nature bullshit? Showing the excesses but putting them in context. You should be helping people make informed decisions about what they demand from the regulatory authorities. Junk DNA sounds more likely to inspire them to go out and bomb the nearest biotech lab.
I curled into the armchair and rested my head on my knees. All right, I give up. Everything you say is true. I'm a manipulative, rabble-rousing anti-science hack.
She frowned. Anti-science? I wouldn't go that far. You're venal, lazy, and irresponsible, but you're not quite ignorance cult material yet.
Your faith is touching. She prodded me with a cushion, affectionately, I think, then went back to the kitchen. I covered my face with my hands, and the room started tipping. I should have been jubilant. It was over. The revival was the very last piece of filming for junk DNA. No more paranoid billionaires mutating into self-contained walking ecologies. No more insurance firms designing personal actuarial implants to monitor diet, exercise, and exposure to pollutants for the sake of endlessly recomputing the wearer's most probable date and cause of death. No more voluntary autists lobbying for the right to have their brains surgically mutilated so they could finally attain the condition nature hadn't quite granted them. I went into my workroom and unreeled the fiber optic umbilical from the side of the editing console. I lifted my shirt and cleared some unnameable debris from my navel, then extracted the skin-colored plug with my fingernails, exposing a short stainless steel tube ending in an opalescent laser port. Gina called out from the kitchen,
"Are you performing unnatural acts with that machine again?"
I was too tired to think of an intelligent retort. I snapped the connectors together, and the console lit up. The screen showed everything as it came through. 8 hours worth in 60 seconds, most of it an incomprehensible blur, but I averted my gaze anyway. I didn't much feel like reliving any of the night's events, however briefly. Gina wandered in with a plate of toast. I hit a button to conceal the image. She said, "I still want to know how you can have 4,000 terabytes of RAM in your peritoneal cavity and no visible scars." I glanced down at the connector socket. What do you call that? Invisible?
Too small. 800 terabyte chips are 30 millimeters wide. I looked up the manufacturer's catalogue.
Sherlock strikes again. Or should I say Shylock? Scars can be erased, can't they?
Yes, but would you have obliterated the marks of your most important rite of passage?
Oh, spare me the anthropological babble.
I do have an alternative theory.
I'm not confirming or denying anything. She let her gaze slide over the blank console screen, up to the Repo Man poster on the wall behind it. A motorcycle cop standing behind a dilapidated car. She caught my eye, then gestured at the caption, "Don't look in the trunk." Why not? What's in the trunk?
Why not? What's in the trunk?
I laughed. You can't bear it anymore, can you? You're just gonna have to watch the movie.
Yeah.
The console beeped. I unhooked. Gina looked at me curiously. The expression on my face must have betrayed something.
So is it like sex, or more like defecation?
It's more like confession.
You've never been to confession in your life.
No, but I've seen it in the movies. I was joking, though. It's not like anything at all. She glanced at her watch, then kissed me on the cheek, leaving toast crumbs.
I have to run. Get some sleep, you idiot. You look terrible.
I sat and listened to her bustling around. She had a 90-minute train journey every morning to the CSIRO's wind turbine research station, west of the Blue Mountains. I usually got up at the same time myself, though. It was better than waking alone. I thought, I do love her, and if I concentrate, if I follow the rules, there's no reason why it can't last. My 18-month record was looming, but that was nothing to fear. We'd smash it easily. She reappeared in the doorway.
So how long do you have to edit this one?
3 weeks exactly, counting today. I hadn't really wanted to be reminded.
Today doesn't count. Get some sleep.
We kissed. She left. I swung my chair around to face the blank console. Nothing was over. I was going to have to watch Daniel Cavallini die 100 more times before I could finally disown him. I limped into the bedroom and undressed. I hung my clothes on the cleaning rack and switched on the power. The polymers in the various fabrics expelled all their moisture in a faint, humid exhalation, then packed the remaining dirt and dried sweat into a fine, loose dust, and discarded it electrostatically. I watched it drift down into the receptacle. It was always the same disconcerting blue, something to do with the particle size. I had a quick shower, then climbed into bed. I set the alarm clock for 2 in the afternoon. The farm unit beside the clock said, "Shall I prepare a melatonin course to get you back in sync by tomorrow evening?" Yeah, okay. I stuck my thumb in the sampling tube. There was a barely perceptible sting as blood was taken. Non-invasive NMR models had been in the shops for a couple of years, but they were still too expensive.
"Do you want something to help you sleep now?"
Yes. The farm began to hum softly. That's farm, P-H-A-R-M, by the way, as in pharmacy. Or pharmacopoeia. Or pharmaceutical. The farm began to hum softly, creating a sedative tailored to my current biochemical state, in a dose in accordance with my intended sleeping time. The synthesizer inside used an array of programmable catalysts, 10 billion electronically reconfigurable enzymes bound to a semiconductor chip. Immersed in a small tank of precursor molecules, the chip could assemble a few milligrams of any one of 10,000 drugs, or at least any of the ones for which I had software, for as long as I kept paying the license fees. That's familiar. The machine disgorged a small tablet, still slightly warm. I bit into it. "Orange-flavored after a hard night. You remembered." I lay back and waited for the drug to take effect. I'd watched the expression on his face, but those muscles were palsied, uncontrollable. I'd heard his voice, but the breath he spoke with was not his own. I had no real way of knowing what he'd experienced. Not the monkey's paw or the telltale heart. More like the premature burial. But I had no right to mourn Daniel Cavallini. I was going to sell his death to the world. And I had no right even to empathize, to imagine myself in his place. As Lukowski had pointed out, it could never have happened to me. Chapter 3. I'd seen a 1950s moviola once, in a glass case in a museum. 35mm celluloid traveled a tortuous path through the guts of the machine, moving back and forth between 2 belt-driven spools held up on vertical arms behind the tiny viewing screen. The whine of the motor, the grinding of the gears, the helicopter whir of the shutter blades, sounds coming from an AV of the machine in action, showing on a panel below the display case, had made it seem more like a shredding device than any kind of editing tool. An appealing notion. I'm very sorry, but that scene has been lost forever. The moviola ate it. Standard practice, of course, had been to work only with a copy of the camera original, usually an unviewable negative anyway, but the idea of one slip of a cog transforming meters of precious celluloid into confetti had stuck in my head ever since, a glorious, illicit fantasy. My 3-year-old 2052 Affine graphics editing console was incapable of destroying anything. Every shot I downloaded was burned into 2 independent write-once memory chips, and also encrypted and sent automatically to archives in Mandela, Stockholm, and Toronto. Every editing decision that followed was just a rearrangement of the references to the untouchable signal. I could quote from the raw footage, and footage it was. Only dilettantes used pretentious neologisms like bitage, as selectively as I wished. I could paraphrase, substitute, and improvise, but not one frame of the original could ever be damaged or misplaced, beyond repair, beyond recovery. I didn't really envy my analog-era counterparts, though. The painstaking mechanics of their craft would have driven me mad. The slowest step in digital editing was human decision-making, and I'd learned to get most judgments right by the 10th or 12th attempt. Software could tweak the rhythms of a scene, fine-tune every cut, finesse the sound, remove unwanted passerby, even shift whole buildings if necessary. The mechanics was all taken care of. There was nothing to distract from the content. So all I had to do with junk DNA was transform 180 hours of real time into 50 minutes of sense. I'd filmed 4 stories, and I already knew how I'd order them, a gradual progression from gray to black. Ned Lander's The Walking Biosphere, the Health Guard Actuarial Implant, the Voluntary Autists Lobby Group, and Daniel Cavallini's Revival. CNET had asked for excess, for transgressions, for Frankenscience. I'd have no trouble giving them exactly what they wanted. Landers had made his money in dry computers, not biotech, but he'd gone on to buy several R&D-intensive molecular genetics corporations to help him achieve his personal transformation. He'd begged me to film him in a sealed geodesic dome full of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and benzyl compounds, me in a pressure suit, himself in swimming trunks. We'd tried it, but my faceplate kept fogging up on the outside with oily carcinogenic residues, so we'd had to meet again in downtown Portland. Promising as the noxious dome had seemed, the immaculate blue skies of the state which was racing California to zero-emission laws for every known pollutant had turned out to be a more surreal backdrop by far. "I don't need to breathe at all if I don't want to," Landers had confided, surrounded by a visible abundance of clean, fresh air. This time I'd persuaded him to do the interview in a small, grassy park opposite the NL Group's modest headquarters. There were children playing soccer in the background, but the console would keep track of any continuity problems and offer solutions to most of them with a single keystroke. Landers was in his late 40s, but he could have passed for 25. With a robust build, golden hair, blue eyes, and glowing pink skin, he looked more like a Hollywood version of a Kansas farm worker, in good times, than a rich eccentric whose body was swarming with engineered algae and alien genes. I watched him on the console's flat screen and listened through simple stereo speakers. I could have fed the playback straight into my optic and auditory nerves, but most viewers would be using a screen or a headset, and I needed to be sure that the software really had constructed a steady, plausible, rectilinear grid of pixels out of my own retina's highly compressed visual shorthand. "The symbiotes living in my bloodstream can turn carbon dioxide back into oxygen indefinitely. They get some energy through my skin from sunlight, and they release any glucose they can spare, but that's not nearly enough for me to live on, and they need an alternative energy source when they're in darkness. That's where the symbiotes in my stomach and intestines come in. I have 37 different types, and between them, they can handle anything." Excuse me. Let me pound some water. My diaphragm rebels. "That's where the symbiotes in my stomach and intestines come in. I have 37 different types, and between them they can handle anything. I can eat grass. I can eat paper. I could live off old tires if I had a way of cutting them into pieces small enough to swallow. If all plant and animal life vanished from the face of the earth tomorrow, I could survive off tires for 1,000 years. I have a map showing all the tire dumps in the continental USA. The majority are scheduled for biological remediation, but I have court actions in progress to see that a number of them survive. Apart from my own personal reasons, I think they're part of our heritage, which we owe to future generations to leave untouched." I went back and intercut some microscope footage of the tailored algae and bacteria inhabiting his blood and digestive tract, then a shot of the tire dump map, which he'd displayed for me on his notepad. I played with an animation I'd been preparing, a schematic of his personal carbon, oxygen, and energy cycles, but I wasn't yet sure where it belonged. I'd prompted him, "So you're immune to famine and mass extinctions, but what about viruses? What about biological warfare or some accidental plague? I cut my words out. They were redundant, and I preferred to intrude as little as possible. The change of topic was a bit of a non sequitur, as things stood, though, so I synthesized a shot of Landers saying, as well as using symbionts, computed to merge seamlessly with his actual words, I'm gradually replacing those cell lines in my body which have the greatest potential for viral infection. Viruses are made of DNA or RNA. They share the same basic chemistry as every other organism on the planet. That's why they can hijack human cells in order to reproduce. But DNA and RNA can be manufactured with totally novel chemistry, with non-standard base pairs to take the place of the normal ones. A new alphabet for the genetic code. Instead of guanine with cytosine, adenine with thymine, instead of G with C, A with T, you can have X with Y, W with Z. I changed his words after thymine to, you can use 4 alternative molecules which don't occur in nature at all. The sense was the same, and it made the point more clearly. But when I replayed the scene, it didn't ring true, so I reverted to the original. Every journalist paraphrased V's subjects. If I'd flatly refused to employ the technique, I wouldn't be working. The trick was to do it honestly, which was about as difficult as imposing the same criterion on the editing process as a whole. I cut in some stock molecular graphics of ordinary DNA, showing every atom in the paired bases which bridged the strands of the helix, and I color-coded and labeled one example of each base. Landers had refused to specify exactly which non-standard bases he was using, but I had found plenty of possibilities in the literature. I had the graphics software substitute 4 plausible new bases for the old ones in the helix, and repeated the slow zoom-in and rotation of the first shot with this hypothetical stretch of Landers' DNA. Then I cut back to his talking head. A simple base-for-base substitution in the DNA isn't enough, of course. Cells need some brand new enzymes to synthesize the new bases, and most of the proteins which interact with DNA and RNA need to be adapted to the change. So the genes for those proteins need to be translated, not just rewritten in the new alphabet. I improvised some graphics illustrating the point, stealing an example of a certain nuclear binding protein from one of the journal articles I'd read, but redrawing the molecules in a different style to avoid copyright violation. We haven't been able to deal with every single human gene which needs translation, but we've made some specific cell lines which work fine with many chromosomes containing only the genes they need. 60% of the stem cells in my bone marrow and thymus have been replaced with versions using neo-DNA. Stem cells give rise to blood cells, including the cells of the immune system. I had to switch my immune system back into an immature state temporarily to make the transition work smoothly. I had to go through some of the childhood clonal deletion phases all over again to weed out anything which might have caused an autoimmune response. But basically, I'm now able to shoot up pure HIV and laugh about it. But there's a perfectly good vaccine. Of course. I cut my own words out and made Landers say, of course there's a vaccine for that. Then, and I have symbionts providing a second, independent immune system anyway. But who knows what's coming along next? I'll be prepared, whatever it is, not by anticipating the specifics, which no one could ever do, but by making sure that no vulnerable cell in my body still speaks the same biochemical language as any virus on Earth. And in the long term, it's taken a lot of expensive infrastructure to provide you with all these safeguards. What if that technology doesn't survive long enough for your children and grandchildren? This was all redundant, so I ditched it. In the long term, of course, I'm aiming to modify the stem cells which produce my sperm. My wife Carol has already begun a program of ova collection, and once we've translated the entire human genome and replaced all 23 chromosomes in sperm and ova, everything we've done will be heritable. Any child of ours will use pure neo-DNA, and all the symbionts will pass from mother to child in the womb. We'll translate the genomes of the symbionts as well into a third genetic alphabet to protect them from viruses and to eliminate any risk of accidental gene exchange. They'll be our crops and our herds, our birthright, our inalienable dominion, living in our blood forever. And our children will be a new species of life,
More than a new species, a whole new kingdom.
The soccer players in the park cheered. Someone had scored a goal. I left it in. Landers beamed suddenly, radiantly, as if he was contemplating this strange Arcadia for the very first time.
That's what I'm creating. A new kingdom.
I sat at the console 18 hours a day and forced myself to live as if the world had shrunk, not to the workroom itself, but to the times and places captured in the footage. Gina left me to it. She'd survived the editing of Gender Scrutiny Overload, so she already knew exactly what to expect. She said blithely, "I'll just pretend that you're out of town, and that the lump in the bed is a large hot water bottle." My farm programmed a small skin patch on my shoulder to release carefully timed and calibrated doses of melatonin, or a melatonin blocker, adding to, or subtracting from, the usual biochemical signal produced by my pineal gland, reshaping the normal sine wave of alertness into a plateau followed by a deep, deep trough. I woke every morning from 5 hours of enriched REM sleep, as wide-eyed and energetic as a hyperactive child, my head spinning with 1,000 disintegrating dreams, most of them elaborate remixes of the previous day's editing. I wouldn't so much as yawn until 11:45, but 15 minutes later I'd go out like a light. Melatonin was a natural circadian hormone, far safer and more precise in its effects than crude stimulants like caffeine or amphetamines. I'd tried caffeine a few times. It made me believe I was focused and energetic, but it turned my judgment to shit. Widespread use of caffeine explained a lot about the 20th century. I know caffeine makes me terrible at math. I knew that when I went off the melatonin, I'd suffer a short period of insomnia and daytime drowsiness, an overshoot of the brain's attempts to counteract the imposed rhythm. But the side effects of the alternatives were worse. Carol Landers had declined to be interviewed, which was a shame. It would have been quite a coup to have chatted with the next mitochondrial Eve. Landers had refused to comment on whether or not she was currently using the symbionts. Perhaps she was waiting to see if he'd continue to flourish, or whether he'd suffer a population explosion of some mutant bacterial strain and go into toxic shock. I'd been permitted to speak to a few of Landers' senior employees, including the 2 geneticists who were doing most of the R&D. They were coy when it came to discussing anything beyond the technicalities, but their general attitude seemed to be that any freely chosen treatment which helped safeguard an individual's health, and which posed no threat to the public at large, was ethically unimpeachable. They had a point, at least from the biohazard angle. Working with neo-DNA meant there was no risk of accidental recombination. Even if they'd flushed all their failed experiments straight into the nearest river, no natural bacterium could have taken up the genes and made use of them. Implementing Landers' vision of the perfect survivalist family was going to take more than R&D, though. Making heritable changes in any human gene was currently illegal in the US, and most other places. Apart from a list of a few dozen authorized repairs for eliminating diseases like muscular dystrophy and cystic fibrosis. Legislation could always be revoked, of course, although Landers' own top biotech attorney insisted that changing the base pairs, even translating a few genes to accommodate that change, wouldn't actually violate the anti-eugenics spirit of the existing law. It wouldn't alter the external characteristics of the children, height, build, pigmentation. It wouldn't influence their IQ or personality. When I'd raised the question of their presumed sterility, barring incest, he'd taken the interesting position that it would hardly be Ned Landers' fault if other people's children were sterile with respect to his own. There were no infertile people, after all, only infertile couples. An expert in the field at Columbia University said all of this was bullshit. Substituting whole chromosomes, whatever the phenotypic effects, would simply be illegal. Another expert at the University of Washington was less certain. If I had had the time, I could probably have collected 100 sound bites of eminent jurists expressing every conceivable shade of opinion on the subject. I'd spoken to a number of Lander's critics, including Jane Summers, a freelance biotech consultant based in San Francisco, and a prominent member of Molecular Biologists for Social Responsibility. 6 months earlier, writing in the semi-public MBSR netzine, which my knowledge miner was always scrutinizing diligently, she'd claimed to have evidence that several thousand wealthy people in the U.S. and elsewhere were having their DNA translated, cell type by cell type. Landers, she'd said, was merely the only one to have gone public, to act as a kind of decoy, a lone eccentric, defusing the issue, making it seem like one man's ridiculous, yet almost quixotic, fantasy. Or quixotic. I've heard it pronounced both ways. I prefer quixotic, because it's Don Quixote, but if that's wrong, then I can change. I swear I can change. Making it seem like one man's ridiculous, yet almost quixotic, fantasy. If the research had been exposed in the media with no specific person associated with it, paranoia would have reigned. There would have been no limit to the possible membership of the nameless elite who planned to divorce themselves from the biosphere. But since it was all out in the open, and all down to harmless Ned Landers, there was really nothing to fear. The theory made a certain amount of sense, but Summers' evidence hadn't been forthcoming. She'd reluctantly put me in touch with an industry source, who'd supposedly been involved in gene translation work for an entirely different employer, but the source had denied everything. Pressed for other leads, Summers had become evasive. Either she'd never had anything substantial, or she'd made a deal with another journalist to keep the competition away. It was frustrating, but in the end I hadn't the time or resources to pursue the story independently. If there really was a cabal of genetic separatists, I'd just have to read the exclusive in the Washington Post like everyone else. I closed with a medley of other commentators, bioethicists, geneticists, sociologists, mostly dismissing the whole affair. Mr. Landers has the right to live his own life and raise his own children any way he sees fit. We don't persecute the Amish for their inbreeding, their strange technology, their desire for independence. Why persecute him for essentially the same crimes? In quotes. The final cut of the story was 18 minutes long. In the broadcast version, there'd only be room for 12. I pared away mercilessly, summarizing and simplifying, taking care to do a professional job, but not too worried by the loss of detail. Most real-time broadcasts on CNET served no purpose but to focus publicity, and to guarantee reviews in some of the more conservative media. Junk DNA was scheduled for 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. The vast majority of the audience would log on to the full interactive version at their convenience. As well as a slightly longer linear backbone, the interactive would be peppered with optional detours to other sources, all the technical journal articles I'd read from my own research, and all the articles they in turn cited, other media coverage of Landers and of Jane Summers' conspiracy theory, the relevant U.S. and international statutes, and even trails leading into the quagmire of potentially relevant case law. On the evening of the 5th day of editing, right on schedule, reason enough for minor jubilation, I tidied up all the loose ends and ran through the segment one last time. I tried to clear away all my memories of filming and all my preconceptions, and watch the story like a CNET viewer who'd seen nothing at all on the subject before, save a few misleading promotions for the documentary itself. Landers came across surprisingly sympathetically. I'd thought I'd been harsher. I'd thought I'd at least given him every opportunity to damn himself with his earnest account of his surreal ambitions. Instead, he seemed far more good-humored than po-faced. He almost appeared to be sharing all the jokes. Living off tire dumps? Shooting up HIV? I watched, amazed. I couldn't decide if there really was a faint undercurrent of deliberate irony, a hint of self-deprecation in his manner which I'd somehow missed before, or whether the subject matter simply made it impossible for a sane viewer to interpret his words any other way. What if Summers was right? What if Landers was a decoy, a distraction, a consummate performing clown? What if thousands of the planet's wealthiest people really were planning to grant themselves and their offspring perfect genetic isolation and absolute viral immunity? Would it matter? The rich had always cut themselves off from the rabble, one way or another. Pollution levels would continue to decline, whether or not algal symbionts rendered fresh air obsolete. And anyone who chose to follow in Lander's footsteps was no great loss to the human gene pool. There was only one small question which remained unanswered, and I tried not to give it too much thought. Absolute viral immunity against what? Chapter 4. Delphic biosystems had been too generous by far. Not only had they arranged for me to interview 10 times as many of their public relations staff as I could ever have made time for, they'd showered me with ROMs packed with seductive micrographs and dazzling animation. Software flowcharts for the Health Guard implant were rendered as airbrushed fantasies of impossible chromed machines, jet-black conveyor belts moving incandescent silver nuggets of data from sub-process to sub-process. Molecular schematics of interacting proteins were shrouded with delicately beautiful and utterly gratuitous electron density maps, veils of pink and blue aurorae melting and merging, transforming the humblest chemical wedding into a microcosmic fantasia. I could have set it all to Wagner, or Blake, and flogged it to members of mystical renaissance, to play on a loop whenever they wanted to go slack-jogged with numinous incomprehension. I slogged my way through the whole morass, though, and it finally paid off. Buried amongst all the technoporn and science as psychedelia were a few shots worth salvaging. The Health Guard implant employed the latest programmable assay chip, an array of elaborate proteins bound to silicon, in many respects like a farm's synthesizer, but designed to count molecules, not make them. The previous generation of chips had used a multitude of highly specific antibodies, Y-shaped proteins planted in the semiconductor in a checkerboard pattern, like adjoining fields of 100 different crops. When a molecule of cholesterol, or insulin, or whatever, happened to strike exactly the right field and collide with a matching antibody, it bound to it long enough for the tiny change in capacitance to be detected and logged in a microprocessor. Over time, this record of serendipitous collisions yielded the amount of each substance in the blood. The new sensors used a protein which was more like a Venus flytrap with brains than an antibody's passive, single-purpose template. Asaein, in its receptive state, was a long, bell-shaped molecule, a tube opening out into a broad funnel. This conformation was metastable. The charge distribution on the molecule rendered it exquisitely sensitive, spring-loaded. Anything large enough colliding with the inner surface of the funnel caused a lightning-fast wave of deformation, engulfing and shrink-wrapping the intruder. The microprocessor, noting the sprung trap, could then probe the captive molecule by searching for a shape of the Asaein which imprisoned it even more snugly. There were no more wasted, mismatched collisions, no more insulin molecules striking cholesterol antibodies, yielding no information at all. Asaein always knew what had hit it. It was a technical advance worth communicating, worth explaining, worth demystifying. Whatever the social implications of the Health Guard implant, they could no more be presented in a vacuum. Divorced from the technology which made the device possible, than vice versa. Once people ceased to understand how the machines around them actually functioned, the world they inhabited began to dissolve into an incomprehensible dreamscape. Technology moved beyond control, beyond discussion, evoking only worship or loathing, dependence or alienation. Arthur C. Clarke had suggested that any sufficiently advanced technology would be indistinguishable from magic, referring to a possible encounter with an alien civilization, but if a science journalist had one responsibility above all else, it was to keep Clarke's law from applying to human technology in human eyes. Lofty sentiments, and here I was peddling Frankenscience, because that was the niche that had needed filming. I salved my conscience, or numbed it for a while, with platitudes about Trojan horses, and changing the system from within. I took the Delphic Biosystems graphics of Asaean in action, and had the console strip away the excessive decoration so it was possible to see clearly what was going on. I threw out the gushing commentary and wrote my own. The console delivered it in the diction profile I'd chosen for all of Junk DNA's narration, cloned from samples of an English actor named Juliet Stevenson. The long-vanished Standard English pronunciation, like any contemporary UK accent, remained easily comprehensible across the vast Anglophone world. Any viewer who wished to hear a different voice could cross-translate at will, though. I often listened to programs redubbed into the regional accents I had most trouble following: U.S. Southeast, Northern Irish, and East Central African, hoping to sharpen my ear for them. Hermes, my communications software, was programmed to bounce almost everyone on Earth while I was editing. Lydia Higuchi, CNET's West Pacific Commissioning Executive Producer, was one of the few exceptions. It was my notepad that rang, but I switched the call through to the console itself. The screen was larger and clearer, and the camera stamped its signal with the words, "A fine graphics editor model 2052-KL," and a time code. Not very subtle, but it wasn't meant to be. Lydia got straight to the point. She said, "I saw the final cut of the Lander stuff. It's good, but I want to talk about what comes next." "The Health Guard implant? Is there some problem?" I didn't hide my irritation. She'd seen selections of the raw footage. She'd seen all my post-production notes. If she wanted anything significant changed, she'd left it too damn late. She laughed. "Andrew, take one step back. Not the next story in Junk DNA. Your next project." I eyed her as if she'd casually raised the prospect of imminent travel to another planet. I said, "Don't do this to me, Lydia. Please. You know I can't think rationally about anything else right now." She nodded sympathetically, but said, "I take it you've been monitoring this new disease? It's not anecdotal static anymore. There are official reports coming out of Geneva, Atlanta, Nairobi." My stomach tightened. "You mean acute clinical anxiety syndrome?" "AKA distress." She seemed to savor the word, as if she'd already adopted it into her vocabulary of deeply telegenic subjects. My spirits sank even further. I said, "My knowledge miner's been logging everything on it, but I haven't had time to stay up to date. And frankly, right now, there are over 400 diagnosed cases, Andrew. That's a 30% rise in the last 6 months. How can anyone diagnose something when they don't have a clue what it is? Process of elimination." "Yeah, I think it's bullshit too." "Yeah, I think it's bullshit too." She mimed brief sarcastic amusement. "Get serious. This is a brand new mental illness, possibly communicable, possibly caused by an escaped military pathogen, possibly fallen from a comet, possibly a punishment from God. Amazing how many things are possible, isn't it?" She shrugged. "Whatever the cause, it's spreading. There are cases everywhere now but Antarctica. This is headline news, and more. The board decided last night we're going to commission a 30-minute special on distress. High-profile, blitz promotion culminating in synchronous primetime broadcasts worldwide." Synchronous didn't mean what it should have in NetSpeak. It meant the same calendar date and local time for all viewers. "Worldwide? You mean Anglophone world?" "I mean world. We're tying up arrangements on
We're tying up arrangements to on-sell to other language networks.
Well, good. Lydia smiled, a tight-lipped, impatient smile.
Are you being coy, Andrew? Do I have to spell it out? We want you to make it. You're our biotech specialist. You're the logical choice. And you'll do a great job. So?
I put a hand to my forehead and tried to work out why I felt so claustrophobic. I said, "How long do I have to decide?" She smiled even more widely, which meant she was puzzled, annoyed, or both.
We're broadcasting on May 24th. That's 10 weeks from Monday. You'll need to start pre-production the minute junk DNA is finished, so we need your answer as soon as possible.
Rule number 4. Discuss everything with Gina first, whether or not she'd ever admit to being offended if you didn't. I said, "Tomorrow morning." Lydia wasn't happy, but she said, "That's fine." I steeled myself. "If I say no, is there anything else going?" Lydia looked openly astonished now.
What's wrong with you? Primetime world broadcast. You'll make 5 times as much on this as on gender.
I realize that, and I'm grateful for the chance, believe me. I just want to know if there's any other choice.
You could always go and hunt for coins on the beach with a metal detector.
She saw my face and softened. Slightly.
There's another project about to go into pre-production, although I very nearly promised it to Sarah Knight.
Tell me.
Ever heard of Violet Mosala?
Of course. She's a physicist? A South African physicist?
2 out of 2. Very impressive. Sarah's a huge fan. She chewed my ear off about her for an hour.
So, what's the project?
A profile of Mosala, who's 27 and won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago. But you knew that all along, didn't you? Interviews, biography, appraisals by colleagues, blah, blah, blah. Her work's purely theoretical, so there's nothing much to show of it except computer simulations, and she's offered us her own graphics. But the heart of the program will be the Einstein Centenary Conference.
Wasn't that in 1970-something? Lydia gave me a withering look. I said, Centenary of Death. Charming.
Mosala is attending the conference, on the last day of which 3 of the world's top theoretical physicists are scheduled to present rival versions of the theory of everything. And you don't get 3 guesses as to who's the alpha favorite.
I gritted my teeth and suppressed the urge to say, "It's not a horse race, Lydia. It might be another 50 years before anyone knows whose toe was right. TOE, or theory of everything, toe." So, when's the conference?
April 15th to 18th.
I blanched. 3 weeks from Monday. Lydia looked thoughtful for a moment, then pleased.
You don't really have time, do you? Sarah's been prepared for this for months.
I said irritably, 5 seconds ago you were talking about me starting pre-production on Distress in less than 3 weeks.
You could walk straight into that. How much modern physics do you know?
I feigned indignation. Enough! And I'm not stupid. I can catch up.
When?
I'll make time. I'll work faster. I'll finish junk DNA ahead of schedule. When's the Mosala program going to be broadcast?
Early next year.
Which meant 8 whole months of relative sanity, once the conference was over. Lydia glanced at her watch redundantly.
I don't understand you. A high-profile special on Distress would be the logical endpoint of everything you've been doing for the last 5 years. After that, you could think about switching away from biotech. And who am I going to use instead of you?
Sarah Knight?
Don't be sarcastic.
I'll tell her you said that.
Be my guest. I don't care what she's done in politics. She's only made 1 science program, and that was on fringe cosmology. It was good, but not good enough to ramp her straight into something like this. She's earned a fortnight with Violet Mosala, but not a primetime broadcast on the world's alpha-most virus.
Nobody had found a virus associated with Distress. I hadn't seen a news bulletin for a week, but my knowledge miner would have told me if there had been a breakthrough of that magnitude. I was beginning to get the queasy feeling that if I didn't make the program myself, it would be subtitled, "How an Escaped Military Pathogen Became the 21st Century AIDS of the Mind." pure vanity. What did I think? I was the only person on the planet capable of deflating the rumors and hysteria surrounding distress? I said, I haven't made any decision yet. I need to talk it over with Gina. Lydia was skeptical. Okay, fine. Talk it over with Gina and call me in the morning. She glanced at her watch again. Look, I really have to go. Some of us actually have work to do. I opened my mouth to protest, outraged. She smiled sweetly and aimed 2 fingers at me. Gotcha. No sense of irony, you auteurs. Bye. I turned away from the console and sat staring down at my clenched fists, trying to untangle what I was feeling, if only enough to enable me to put it all aside and get back to junk DNA. I'd seen a brief news shot of someone with distress a few months before. I'd been in a hotel room in Manchester, flicking channels between appointments. A young woman, looking healthy but disheveled, was lying on her back in a corridor in an apartment building in Miami. She was waving her arms wildly, kicking in all directions, tossing her head and twisting her whole body back and forth. It hadn't looked like the product of any kind of crude neurological dysfunction, though. It had seemed too coordinated, too purposeful. And before the police and paramedics could hold her still, or still enough to get a needle in, and pump her full of some high-powered court-order paralytic like Straitjacket or Medusa, they'd tried the sprays and they hadn't worked, she'd thrashed and screamed like an animal in mortal agony, like a child in a solipsistic rage, like an adult in the grip of the blackest despair. I'd watched and listened in disbelief, and when, mercifully, she'd been rendered comatose and dragged away, I'd struggled to convince myself that it had been nothing out of the ordinary, some kind of epileptic fit, some kind of psychotic tantrum, at worst some kind of unbearable physical pain, the cause of which would be swiftly identified and dealt with. None of which was true. Victims of distress rarely had a history of neurological or mental illness, and bore no signs of injury or disease. And no one had the slightest idea how to deal with the cause of their suffering. The only current treatment consisted of sustained, heavy sedation. I picked up my notepad and touched the icon for Sisyphus, my knowledge miner. I said, assemble a briefing on Violet Mosala, the Einstein Centenary Conference, and the last 10 years' advances in unified field theories. I'll need to digest it all in about 120 hours. Is that feasible? There was a pause while Sisyphus downloaded the relevant sources and scrutinized them. Then it asked, do you know what an ATM is? An automated teller machine? No. In this context, an ATM is an all-topologies model. The phrase sounded vaguely familiar. I'd probably skimmed through a brief article on the topic 5 years before. There was another pause, while more elementary background material was downloaded and assessed. Then, 120 hours would be good enough for listening and nodding, not for asking intelligent questions. I groaned. How long for 150? Do it. I hit the icon for the farm unit and said, recompute my melatonin doses. Give me 2 more hours of peak alertness a day, starting immediately. Until when? The conference began on April 5th. If I wasn't an expert on Violet Mosala by then, it would be too late. But I couldn't risk cutting loose from the forced rhythms of the melatonin and rebounding into erratic sleep patterns in the middle of filming. April 18th. The farm said, you'll be sorry. That was no generic warning. It was a prediction based on 5 years' worth of intimate biochemical knowledge. But I had no real choice, and if I spent the week after the conference suffering from acute circadian arrhythmia, it would be unpleasant, but it wouldn't kill me. I did some calculations in my head. Somehow I'd just conjured up 5 or 6 hours of free time out of thin air. It was a Friday. I phoned Gina at work. Rule number 6. Be unpredictable, but not too often. I said, screw junk DNA. Want to go dancing? Heck with it, let's do one more chapter. I have a little time. Chapter 5. It was Gina's idea to go deep into the city. The ruins held no attraction for me, and there was far better nightlife closer to home, but, rule number 7, it wasn't worth an argument. When the train pulled into Town Hall Station, and we took the escalators up past the platform where Daniel Cavallini had been stabbed to death, I blanked my mind and smiled. Gina linked arms with me and said,
"There's something here I don't feel anywhere else. An energy, a buzz. Can't you feel it?"
I looked around at the station's black and white tiled walls, graffiti-proof and literally antiseptic. No more than in Pompeii. The demographic center of Greater Sydney had been west of Parramatta for at least half a century. The demographic center of Greater Sydney had been west of Parramatta for at least half a century, and had probably reached Blacktown by now, but the demise of the historical urban core had begun in earnest only in the 30s, when office space, cinemas, theaters, physical galleries, and public museums had all become obsolete more or less at the same time. Broadband optical fibers had been connected to most residential buildings since the teens, but it had taken another 2 decades for the networks to mature. The tottering edifice of incompatible standards, inefficient hardware, and archaic operating systems thrown together by the fin de siècle dinosaurs of computing and communications had been razed to the ground in the 20s, and only then, after years of premature hype and well-earned backlashes of cynicism and ridicule, could the use of the networks for entertainment and telecommuting be transmuted from a form of psychological torture into a natural and convenient alternative to 90% of physical travel. Data throughput is hard. We stepped out onto George Street. It was far from deserted, but I'd seen footage from days when the country's population was half as much, and it shamed these meager crowds. Gina looked up, and her eyes caught the lights. Many of the old office towers still dazzled, their windows decorated for the tourists with cheap sunlight-storing luminescent coatings. The ruins was a joke, of course. Vandalism, let alone time, had scarcely made a mark. But we were all tourists here, come to gawk at the monuments left behind, not by our ancestors, but by our older siblings. Few buildings had been converted for residential use, the architecture and economics had never added up, and some urban preservationists actively campaigned against it. There were squatters, of course, probably a couple of thousand, spread throughout what was still referred to as the Central Business District, but they only added to the post-apocalyptic mood. Live theater and music survived out in the suburbs, with small plays in small venues or crowd-pulling coliseum bands in sports stadia, but mainstream theater was performed in real-time VR over the networks. The Opera House, foundations rotting, was currently predicted to slide into Sydney Harbour in 2065. A delightful prospect, though I suspected that some group of saccharine-blooded killjoys would raise the money to rescue the useless icon at the last moment. Walk-in retailing, such as it was, had long ago moved entirely to regional centers. There were a few hotels still open on the fringes of the city, but restaurants and nightclubs were all that remained in the dead heart, spread out between the empty towers like souvenir stalls scattered among the pyramids at Giza. We headed south into what had once been Chinatown. The crumbling decorative facades of deserted emporia still attested to that, even if the cuisine didn't. Gina nudged me gently and directed my attention to a group of people strolling north, on the opposite side of the street. When they'd passed, she said, "Were they—" "What? Asexuals? I think so." "I'm never sure. There are naturals who look now different." "But that's the whole point. You can never be sure. But why did we ever think we could discover anything that mattered about a stranger at a glance?" Asex was really nothing but an umbrella term for a broad group of philosophies, styles of dress, cosmetic surgical changes, and deep biological alterations. The only thing that one asex person necessarily had in common with another was the view that vis-gender parameters, neural, endocrine, chromosomal, and genital, were the business of no one but herself, usually, but not always, vis-lovers, probably vis-doctor, and sometimes a few close friends. What a person actually did in response to that attitude could range from as little as ticking the A box on census forms, to choosing an asex name, to breast or body hair reduction, voice timbre adjustment, facial resculpting, empouchment, surgery to render the male genitals retractable, all the way to full physical and or neural asexuality, hermaphroditism, or exoticism. I said, why bother staring at people and guessing? On male, on femme, asex, who cares? Gina scowled.
Don't make me out to be some kind of bigot. I'm just curious.
I squeezed her hand. I'm sorry, that's not what I meant. She pulled free.
You got to spend a year thinking about nothing else, being as voyeuristic and intrusive as you liked, and getting paid for it. I only saw the finished documentary. I don't see why I should be expected to have reached some final position on gender migration just because you've rolled credits on the subject.
I bent over and kissed her on the forehead.
What was that for?
For being the ideal viewer, above and beyond all your many other virtues.
I think I'm going to throw up.
We turned east towards Surrey Hills into an even quieter street. A grim young man strode by alone, heavily muscled and probably facially sculpted, but again, there was no way to be sure. Gina glanced at me, still angry but unable to resist.
That, assuming he was male, I understand even less. If someone wants a build like that, fine. But why the face as well? It's not as if anyone would be likely to mistake him for anyone but an male without it.
Without it? No, but being mistaken for an male would be an insult, because he's migrated out of that gender as surely as any asex. The whole point of being male is to distance yourself from the perceived weakness of contemporary natural males, to declare that their consensual identity, stop laughing, is so much less masculine than your own that you'd effectively belong to another sex entirely. To say, no mere male can speak on my behalf any more than a woman can. Gina mimed tearing out hair.
Now a woman can speak on behalf of all women, as far as I'm concerned. But I don't feel obliged to have myself sculpted femme or I femme to make that point.
Well, exactly. I feel the same way. Whenever some Iron John cretin writes a manifesto in the name of all men, I'd much rather tell him to his face that he's full of shit than desert the male gender and leave him thinking that he speaks for all those who remain. But that is the commonest reason people cite for gender migration. They're sick of self-appointed gender political figureheads and pretentious mystical Renaissance gurus claiming to represent them. And sick of being libeled for real and imagined gender crimes. If all men are violent, selfish, dominating, hierarchical, what can you do except slit your wrists or migrate from male to I-male or asex? If all women are weak, passive, irrational victims, Gina thumped me on the arm admonishingly.
Now you're caricaturing the caricaturists. I don't believe anyone talks like that.
Only because you move in the wrong circles. Or should I say the right ones? But I thought you watched the program. There were people I interviewed who made exactly those assertions, word for word.
Then it's the fault of the media for giving them publicity.
We'd arrived at the restaurant, but we lingered outside. I said, that's partly true. I don't know what the solution is, though. When will someone who stands up and proclaims, I speak for no one but myself, get as much coverage as someone who claims to speak for half the population?
When people like you give it to them.
You know it's not that simple. And imagine what would have happened with feminism, or the civil rights movements for that matter, if no one could ever be permitted to speak on behalf of any group without their certified unanimous consent. Just because some of the current lunatics are like parodies of the old leaders, it doesn't mean that we'd be better off now if TV producers had said, sorry, Dr. King, sorry, Ms. Greer, sorry, Mr. Perkins, but if you can't avoid these sweeping generalizations and confine your statements to your own personal circumstances, we'll have to take you off the air. Gina eyed me skeptically.
That's ancient history, and you're only arguing that position to try and squirm out of your own responsibilities.
Of course. But the point is, gender migration is 90% politics. Some coverage still treats it as a kind of decadent, gratuitous, fashionable mimicry of gender reassignment for transsexuals, but most gender migrants go no further than superficial asex. They don't cross right over. They have no reason to. It's a protest action, like resigning from a political party or renouncing your citizenship, or deserting a battlefield. But whether it will stabilize at some low level and shake up attitudes enough to remove the whole reason for migration, or whether the population will end up evenly divided between all 7 genders in a couple of generations, I have no idea.
Gina grimaced. 7 genders, and all of them perceived as monolithic. Everyone stereotyped at a glance. 7 pigeonholes instead of 2 isn't progress.
No, but maybe in the long run there'll only be asex, you male and you femme. Those who want to be pigeonholed will be, and those who don't will remain mysterious.
No, in the long run we'll have nothing but VR bodies, and we'll all be mysterious or revelatory in turns as the mood takes us.
I can't wait. We went inside. Unnatural Tastes was a converted department store, cavernous but brightly lit, opened up by the simple expedient of cutting a large elliptical hole. Let me try this again. Opened up by the simple expedient of cutting a large elliptical hole in the middle of every floor. I waved my notepad at the entry turnstile. A voice confirmed our reservation, adding, "Table 519, 5th floor." Gina smiled wickedly.
5th floor, stuffed toys and lingerie.
I glanced up at our fellow diners, mostly you male and you femme couples. I said, "You behave yourself, redneck, or next time we're eating in Epping." The place was 3/4 full, at least, but the seating capacity was less than it seemed. Most of the volume of the building was taken up by the central well. In what was left of each floor, human waiters in tuxedos weaved their way between the chromed tables. It all looked archaic and stylized, almost Marx Brothers to me. I wasn't a big fan of experimental cuisine. Essentially, we'd be guinea pigs, trying out medically safe but otherwise untested bioengineered produce. Gina had pointed out that at least the meal would be subsidized by the manufacturers. I wasn't so sure. Experimental cuisine had become so fashionable lately that it could probably attract a statistically significant sample of diners for each novelty, even at full price. The tabletop flashed up menus as we took our seats, and the figures seemed to confirm my doubts about a subsidy. I groaned. Crimson bean salad? I don't care what color they are. I want to know what they taste like. The last thing I ate here that looked like a kidney bean tasted exactly like boiled cabbage. Gina took her time, prodding the names of half a dozen dishes to view the finished products, and screens of data on the design of the ingredients. She said, "You can work it all out if you pay attention. If you know what genes they move from where, and why, you can make a fair stab at predicting the taste and texture." Go ahead, dazzle me with science. She hit the confirm order button.
"The leafy green stuff will taste like spinach-flavoured pasta, but the iron in it will be absorbed by your body as easily as the heme iron in animal flesh, leaving spinach for dead. The yellow things, which look like corn, will taste like a cross between tomato and green capsicum, spiced with oregano, but nutrients and flavour will be less sensitive to poor storage conditions and overcooking. And the blue puree will taste almost like Parmesan cheese."
Why blue?
"There's a blue pigment, a photoactivated enzyme, in the new self-fermenting lactoberries. They could remove it during processing, but it turns out we metabolize it directly into vitamin D, which is safer than making it the usual way, with UV on the skin."
Food for people who never see the sun. How can I resist? I ordered the same. The service was swift, and Gina's predictions were more or less correct. The whole combination was actually quite pleasant. I said, "You're wasted on wind turbines. You could be designing the spring collection for United Agronomics."
"Gee, thanks. But I already get all the intellectual stimulation I can handle."
How was Big Harold coming along, but anyway?
"Still very much Little Harold, and likely to stay that way for a while.
Little Harold was the 1,000th scale prototype of a projected 200 megawatt turbine.
There are chaotic resonance modes turning up which we missed in the simulations. It's starting to look like we're going to have to reevaluate half of the assumptions of the software model.
I can never quite understand that. You know all the basic physics, the basic equations of airflow dynamics, you have access to endless supercomputer time,
So how can we possibly screw up? Because we can't compute the behavior of thousands of tons of air moving through a complex structure on a molecule-by-molecule basis. All the bulk flow equations are approximations, and we're deliberately operating in a region where the best understood approximations break down. There's no magical new physics coming into play, but we're in a grey zone between one set of convenient simplifying assumptions and another. And so far, the best new set of compromise assumptions are neither convenient nor simple, and they're not even correct, as it turns out.
I'm sorry.
She shrugged. It's frustrating, but enough of it's frustrating in an interesting way to keep me from going insane.
I felt a stab of longing. I understood so little about this part of her life. She'd explained as much as I could follow, but I still had no real idea of what spun through her head when she was sitting at her workstation, juggling airflow simulations or clambering around the wind tunnel making adjustments to Little Harold. I said, I wish you'd let me film some of this. Gina regarded me balefully.
Not a chance, Mr. Franken-Science. Not until you can tell me categorically whether wind turbines are good or evil.
I cringed. You know that's not up to me, and it changes every year. New studies are published, and the alternatives New studies are published. The alternatives come in and out of favor. She cut me off bitterly.
Alternatives? Planting photovoltaic engineered forests or 10,000 times as much land per megawatt sounds like environmental vandalism to me. Alternatives? Planting photovoltaic engineered forests on 10,000 times as much land per megawatt sounds like environmental vandalism to me.
I'm not arguing. I could always make a good turbine documentary, and if I can't sell it straight away, just wait for the tide to turn again.
You can't afford to make anything on spec.
True, I'd have to fit it in between other shooting.
Gina laughed. I wouldn't try it. You can't even manage...
What?
Nothing. Forget it.
She waved a hand, retracting the comment. I could have pressed her, but I would have been wasting my time. I said, speaking of filming, I described the 2 projects Lydia had offered me. Gina listened patiently, but when I asked for her opinion, she seemed baffled.
If you don't want to make distress, then don't. It's really none of my business.
That stung. I said, it affects you too. It would be a lot more money and...
Gina was affronted. What I mean is we could afford to take a holiday or something. We could go overseas next time you have leave, if that's what you wanted.
Oh. That's him. All I mean is we could afford to take a holiday or something. We could go overseas next time you have leave, if that's what you wanted.
She said stiffly, I'm not taking leave for another 18 months, and I can pay for my own holidays.
All right, forget it. I reached over to take her hand. She pulled away, irritated. We ate in silence. I stared down at my plate, running through the rules, trying to decide where I'd gone wrong. Had I broken some taboo about money? We kept separate accounts, sharing the rent 50-50, but we'd both helped each other out many times and given each other small luxuries. What should I have done? Gone ahead and made distress, purely for the money, and only then asked if there were anything we could spend it on together that would make it worthwhile? Maybe I'd made it sound as if I thought she expected to dictate the projects I chose. Maybe I'd made it sound as if I thought she expected to dictate the projects I chose, offending her by seeming to have failed to appreciate the independence she allowed me. My head spun. The truth was, I had no idea what she was thinking. It was all too hard, too slippery. And I couldn't imagine what I could say that might begin to put it right, without the risk of making everything far worse. After a while, Gina said,
So where's the big conference being held?
I opened my mouth, then realized I didn't have a clue. I picked up my notepad and quickly checked the briefing Sisyphus had prepared. On stateless.
Stateless?
She laughed.
You're a burned-out case on biotech, so they're sending you to the world's largest engineered coral island?
I'm only fleeing evil biotech. Stateless is good.
Oh, really? Tell that to the governments who keep it embargoed. Are you sure you won't get thrown in prison when you come home? I'm not going to trade with the wicked anarchists. I'm not even going to film them. Anarcho-syndicalists, get it right. Although they don't even call themselves that, do they? I said, who's they? It depends on who you ask. You should have had a segment on stateless You should have had a segment on stateless injunct DNA. Embargoed or not, they're prospering, and all thanks to biotechnology. That would have balanced the talking corpse. But then I couldn't have called it junk DNA, could I? Exactly, she smiled. Whatever I'd done, I'd been forgiven. I felt my heart pounding, as if I'd been dragged back at the last moment from the edge of an abyss. The dessert we chose tasted like cardboard and snow, but we obligingly filled out the tabletop questionnaires before leaving. We headed north up George Street to Martin Place. There was a nightclub called the Sorting Room in the old post office building. They played Zimbabwean Njari music, multi-layered, hypnotic, but nothing ever metronomic, leaving splinters of rhythm in the brain like the marks of fingernails raked over flesh. Gina danced ecstatically, and the music was so loud that speech was, mercifully, almost impossible. In this wordless place, I could do no wrong. We left just after 1. On the train back to Eastwood, we sat in a corner of the carriage, kissing like teenagers. I wondered how my parents' generation had ever driven their precious cars in such a state. Badly, no doubt. The trip home was 10 minutes, almost too short. I wanted everything to unfold as slowly as possible. I wanted it to last for hours. We stopped a dozen times, walking down from the station. We stood outside the front door for so long that the security system asked us if we'd lost our keys. When we undressed and fell onto the bed together, and my vision lurched, I thought it was just a side effect of passion. When my arms went numb, though, I realized what was happening. I'd pushed myself too far with the melatonin blockers, depleting neurotransmitter reserves in the region of the hypothalamus where alertness was controlled. I'd borrowed too much time, and the plateau was crumbling. Stricken, I said, I don't believe this. I'm sorry. About what? I still had an erection. I forced myself to concentrate. I reached over and hit a button on the farm. Give me half an hour. No, safety limits. 15 minutes, I pleaded. This is an emergency. The farm hesitated, consulting the security system. There is no emergency. You're safe in bed, and the house is under no threat. You're gone. You're recycled. Gina seemed more amused than disappointed. See what happens when you transgress natural limits? I hope you're recording this for junk DNA. Mockery only made her 1,000 times more desirable, but I was already lapsing into microsleeps. I said dolefully, Forgive me. Maybe tomorrow we could... I don't think so. Tomorrow you'll be working till 1 a.m., and I'm not waiting up. She took me by the shoulders and rolled me onto my back, then knelt astride my stomach. I made sounds of protest. She bent over and kissed me on the mouth, tenderly. Come on, you don't really want to waste this rare opportunity, do you? She reached down and stroked my cock. I could feel it respond to her touch, but it barely seemed to be a part of me anymore. I murmured, Ravisher, necrophiliac. I wanted to make a long, earnest speech about sex and communication, but Gina seemed intent on disproving my whole thesis before I could even begin. Talk about bad timing, she said. Is that a yes or a no? I gave up, trying to open my eyes. Go ahead. Something vaguely pleasant began to happen, but my senses were retreating. My body was spinning off into the void. I heard a voice, light years away, whisper something about sweet dreams. But I plunged into the blackness, feeling nothing, and I dreamed of silent oceanic depths, of falling through dark water, alone. And that is where we will call it for today. I do have my schedule for next week here somewhere. I think it was Tuesday, Thursday, Friday?
That's what my gut is telling me. It's Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday is what we've got for this upcoming week. We will continue banging through this one until we're done, and then we'll move on to Citeen once we're finished. If the amount of pages here is relatively consistent and takes me about the same amount of time, then we should be done in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the outside, more segments. Maybe 6. Maybe 6. We'll be done within the month for sure. Let me throw in an auxiliary. Bookmark here. That's probably about right. Anyway, let's see. Severo, I didn't give you too much to work with. Thank you for trying. I'll keep thinking about it. If I come up with something, I'll mention it next time or put it in the Discord. Because it does sound very familiar. I can think of a couple short stories that have probably used similar stuff with the whole person having someone's head that they torment. Nameless user 8 says, at Severo, I remember that in a movie. I don't know about a book, though. Also think the God Emperor from Warhammer lives like that. Kinda, sorta, yeah. Yeah, that's kind of the crux of his deal, is he's, I don't actually know what the immediate current up-to-the-date lore is, but as of not too long ago, he's, like, sitting on the Golden Throne and kept in, like, a semi-stasis, just alive enough to, help generate the, what's it called? The big dingus that makes warp travel moderately safe. The thing that produces the Gellar field. There's a name for it. I can't remember. Which allows for faster than light, most of the time, faster than light travel to work. It's still perilous because of the medium in which they have to travel to do that, but the Gellar field makes it somewhat safer. If I'm remembering my 40k lore. This year I'll probably try and get around to doing one of the Caiaphas Cain omnibuses. Omnibi. I know somebody has requested those. Those are fun. But yeah, once we're done with this book, Distress by Greg Egan, we'll move on to Citeen by C.J. Cherryh. And we'll go on from there. Probably read Genesis, the sequel to Citeen, more or less immediately after. I may put a book in between them, like another Greg Egan or something else. So for my bit, other than being kind of weepy and emotionally drained about Dan Simmons being dead, like the week before I finished The Rise of Endymion on stream, other than that, I read through a book entitled Titanium Noir, which was billed to me as being kind of a cyberpunk noir detective thriller. It's not really. It kind of is, but not. It is a detective murder mystery thriller, though. And it plays its notes pretty well. The core conceit ultimately being that if you're super duper 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 wealthy, like stratospherically wealthy, you can afford a treatment called Titanium 7, which basically is a Methuselization drug that allows you to live longer. And what this drug will do is it will basically make you redo puberty all over again. And your body like completely regenerates to about your teenage years equivalent. And starts the clock over, with the side effect that you become like 20 to 25% physically larger. It's a stacking process. So someone who's taken, and these people are called titans because they're bigger than us. They're bigger people. So the more of these treatments you've taken, the bigger you get. So it's that's the core conceit of the series, or of the book. I found it quite entertaining. Not quite as outstanding as, say, as some other things I've read, but relatively recently. But still pretty solid. I was entertained. I wanted to keep reading it, you know. I never felt like I was forcing myself through. It read pretty quickly, and it was an entertaining read. I'm slurring my speech today. I'm not sure what's going on. There's a lot of big atmospheric changes happening where I'm at, so it could be my sinuses are slightly swollen or unswollen in ways they normally aren't. And that sometimes is enough to throw off what appears to be my cognition, but certainly my enunciation. Anyway, that's pretty much it for today. I will see you all Tuesday. Tuesday, March... What is that? March 17th. Something important about the 17th, but I can't remember what it is. Something I have to do for someone, I think. Anyway. That's where we're at. Hope people enjoyed. See you all next time. Toodaloo. Stay safe, stay sane, be decent to each other. That's it. That's the thing that we usually do. Yes, that's the one. Okay. The forms have been obeyed. The ablutions have been done. The canticles